This is Samsak, and in this video we're looking at the Strategic Defense Initiative and the summits between the USA and the USSR from 1985 to 1988. So first of all, we will look at the Strategic Defense Initiative, which is also known as SDI. So at the start of his presidency, Reagan emphasized what he saw as a dangerous and alarming build-up of Soviet armament under Brezhnev. Now, Reagan was also particularly skeptical of MAD, which is mutually assured destruction. Now, this is because he believed that it was a suicide pact. So this meant that he strived to find a method that would eliminate the threat of nuclear weapons. So on March the 23rd, 1983, Reagan proposed the creation of a Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI. Now, this was a missile defense system that would protect the US from any ballistic missiles. This meant that Reagan directed military, scientific and industrial communities in the US to a long-term research project aimed at eliminating the threat of nuclear weapons. This proposed at being able to destroy nuclear weapons in space before they had reached their targets, and it was why it was known as Space Wars. So the Strategic Defense Initiative organization was set up in 1984 under the leadership of Dr. James Ironson, and a wide range of weapon concepts were proposed, such as lasers and particle beam weapons. Although SDI was never actually developed, it was a constant fear for the Soviet Union. This was because it would give the US a de facto nuclear monopoly, because the US would be able to destroy the Soviet nuclear weapons before they had reached their destination. Now, whilst there were critics in the US because they believed that SDI was not feasible, the Soviet Union feared that it would be. Now, this was partly because of the fact that they were lagging in the technological department. So this meant that they started to invest more money into nuclear weapon programs, and it further crippled the Soviet economy and was instrumental in the collapse of the Soviet Union. But in the West, many people were skeptical about SDI, and those in the US felt that the technology would be impossible. In the UK, Margaret Thatcher called it a pie in the sky, and the French President François Mitterrand called for a cooperative approach to outer space. Now, other European allies also saw SDI as a method of disregarding European safety for American safety. On the other hand, Reagan was able to gain particular support from the West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl. Now, in the summits that were to follow, SDI would prove to be a major sticking point, and this was because the Soviets pushed for an abandonment of SDI, whilst Reagan was unwilling to abandon his plans. So both Reagan and Gorbachev were committed to the reduction of nuclear arms, and this meant that they had a number of meetings, starting with Geneva in 1985 and culminating in the INF Treaty in 1987. So the first summit took place in Geneva in November 1985, and it was the first American-Soviet summit for 6 years. Now, although Reagan was a staunch anti-communist, and some were surprised that he was willing to engage in diplomacy with the USSR, he also had the aim to bring the nuclear arms race under control. Gorbachev also wanted better relationships with the USA so that he could carry out his domestic reforms, so that's perestroika glasnost, which we looked at last video. But in the summit, there was a general agreement that both countries would work together in order to cut 50% of their nuclear weapons. Plans were made to limit and hopefully destroy medium-range nuclear weapons. We discussed collaboration to end nuclear proliferation to other countries and the ban of chemical weapons. One of the key achievements of the summit was the relationship that had been created between the two leaders. So Reagan has stated that Gorbachev had warmth in his face and style, not the coldness bordering on hatred I'd seen in most other Soviet leaders I'd met until then. This meant that the two leaders were able to agree on future meetings. Even though there were no concrete agreement, the two leaders issued a joint statement stating that a nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought, and emphasized the importance of preventing any war between the USA and the USSR, whether nuclear or conventional. The one contentious issue that came up was the Strategic Defense Initiative, and Reagan claimed that the USA and the USSR could share a defensive border if either one developed it. However, Gorbachev did not take this claim seriously and stated that nuclear parity between the two sides was essential for security. This meant that Gorbachev would only agree to lower the amount of offensive nuclear weapons if Reagan abandoned SDI. Gorbachev also voiced his concerns that it would only create a war in space. The next summit is the Reykjavik Summit in October 1986, and after Geneva, the two leaders had been sending each other proposals about nuclear arms reduction or even abolition. Now, in January 1986, Gorbachev sent Reagan a letter that outlined his proposal for complete nuclear abolition. And whilst Reagan was keen for such a measure, his administration was against such a measure. So therefore, Reagan offered a tepid reply, claiming that the US would reduce the number of ballistic missiles within the next few years. Now, Gorbachev felt that the diplomacy had started to come to a standstill, and he proposed a meeting in Reykjavik, and Reagan agreed soon after to this meeting. Now, many different proposals were discussed, and they agreed to an unprecedented elimination of all nuclear weapons. However, Gorbachev reiterated that he would only accept this if Reagan was to confine SDI testing to the laboratory. So Reagan was convinced that this would hinder the performance of SDI, so he refused to accept this deal. This meant that he left the final session without an agreement. There were also discussions revolving around the issue of human rights, but once again there was no concrete agreement, just an exchange of ideas. So whilst many historians have claimed that the Reykjavik Summit was a complete failure because the two leaders missed a monumental opportunity to completely eliminate nuclear weapons, there were also many developments. So firstly, both sides gained insight into the other, they both wanted arms reduction, and there were certain limits that they would not abandon. So this meant that the two sides worked tirelessly upon an agreement for the next summit. And this next summit was the Washington Summit in December 1987. And after the Reykjavik Summit, Soviet scientists had convinced Gorbachev that the SDI was not a major threat to the Soviet Union. So this meant that Gorbachev was willing to sign a deal without linking it to SDI restrictions. So the framework for the treaty had been designed by the US Secretary of State, George Shultz, and the Soviet Foreign Minister, Eduard Shevardnadze. Now, the INF Treaty ended the use of all intermediate-range ballistic and cruise missiles, and this meant that those that could travel between 500 and 1,500 kilometers would be destroyed by June 1991. And by 1991, the Americans had destroyed 846 weapons, and the USSR had destroyed 1,846. But the INF Treaty set a very important precedent in the Soviet-American relationships. So it's the first time that the two countries had agreed to remove a whole class of nuclear weapons and the right of on-site inspection. The Soviet Union also made no demands concerning Reagan's SDI, and the Soviet Union didn't demand that they should keep 100 SS-20 missiles as defense against China. The Soviet Union also accepted that Britain and France were not involved in the deal. So the US on-site inspection was established on January the 15th, 1988 to coordinate and implement the inspection provisions of the treaty, and baseline inspections were completed in 1988 by US and Soviet inspectors to verify that the data provided by the two countries was accurate. A further outcome of the agreement came with Gorbachev's decision to withdraw troops from Afghanistan in February 1988. So the final summit between Reagan and Gorbachev was the Moscow Summit, and the official goal of the Moscow Summit was to agree to the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, START, and this aimed to limit the number of nuclear weapons to 5,000 for each side, and this took place between May to June 1988. However, little headway was made towards another arms reduction treaty, and in fact the treaty had started poorly when Reagan had lectured Gorbachev on the need to improve the Soviets' human rights record, and at the end of the summit, Gorbachev and Reagan signed 7 agreements that included fishing rights and cultural exchanges, yet nothing to do with limited nuclear weapons. Now, although little substance was involved in the Moscow Summit, it had given the chance for Reagan to interact with the Soviet population, and at the end of the summit, Reagan had made a speech to Moscow University where he talked about freedom and a Soviet Union free from the chains of totalitarian rule. Now, when the two leaders had strolled through the Red Square, and a journalist had asked him whether he still considered the USSR an evil empire, he replied, "No, that was another time, another era." So this shows the extent to which the relationships had progressed. Now, whilst nothing concrete was achieved, and there were still problems relating to Reagan's SDI, they were able to formalise the INF Treaty after its ratification in the US Senate, and it showed the development of the relationships since Gorbachev had taken over. So thank you for watching this video, and see you soon. Bye.